In the NBA, winning a championship goes far beyond the way players perform out on the court. So many factors such as the coaching staff and the front office play huge roles in getting teams to the promised land, and the way rosters are constructed, team chemistry, and overall decision-making from the higher-ups cannot be ignored. Some franchises have proven to be able to master this, while others have a history of messing things up, but no team is perfect when it comes to giving out contracts. This brings us to the topic of today's video, where we'll be going through every team and identifying the worst contract on the roster that could be holding them back from making better moves. Some teams have egregious contracts, while others have done a relatively good job managing their money, so not every player's contract included in this video is actually terrible by any means, it just happens to be the worst of the group in some cases. This will be a two-part topic for videos, with this one covering the Eastern Conference teams, and my next video will cover the Western Conference teams. Before we start though, it turns out about 66% of you watching right now aren't even subscribed to the channel, so please, if you enjoy the content, consider hitting the subscribe button, as not only does it help out a ton, but I would also very much appreciate it. Now with that being said, let's begin. Going in alphabetical order, we'll start with Atlanta, and the player with the worst contract on the Hawks right now is Bogdan Bogdanovic, who is getting paid about $18 million per year for the next 4 years. The Hawks brought in Bogdanovic to give themselves another dynamic and promising shot-creating threat in the backcourt, but I don't think people realize how old he actually is. He's 28 years old already, and at the end of this contract he'll be 32, and the problem is that he already seems to be regressing a little bit. He got paid and his production has fallen off hard immediately, shooting the ball very subpar efficiency-wise, and this is supposed to be his prime. Next up is the Boston Celtics, and their worst contract right now is Kemba Walker. Kemba's on a full max contract paying him about $35 million per year for the next 3 years, and unfortunately, because of injuries and age, he seems to be already slowing down. The Celtics went out and signed him as a bit of a desperation move to fill the hole left behind by Kyrie Irving, and so far, the investment has not paid off in a way that they were hoping it would, as his production is on the decline and his fit has been questionable at times. Next up is the Brooklyn Nets, and their worst contract right now is DeAndre Jordan. Jordan is making about $10 million a year for the next 3 years, and he was brought in to be the team's main interior presence alongside all of the veteran superstar talent hoping to make a championship run. And the only problem with that is that he's very far past his prime, and his effectiveness as a rim protector on defense is nowhere close to what it once was. Up next is the Charlotte Hornets, and their worst contract right now is Gordon Hayward. Honestly, the Hornets are one of the teams we'll talk about in this video that don't really have a glaringly obvious bad contract, but Hayward's max deal basically becomes the pick by default because of all the other players either being on expiring contracts or on very team-friendly strong deals. Hayward has been exceptional this year, he just might be a tad bit overpaid. The next team up is the Chicago Bulls, and the worst contract on their team right now is Otto Porter. Porter signed a near-max contract worth $28 million a year a few years ago, and unfortunately he never lived up to it. He's missed a lot of time because of injuries, and his time on the court has never been anything close to reminiscent of a max player. Luckily, this year is the last year of that deal, and he will be hitting free agency this summer, but still, his stuck out most as bad business by the franchise. Next up is the Cleveland Cavaliers, and the worst contract on that roster right now is Kevin Love. Kevin Love got a massive contract extension in 2019 worth the max, which was baffling at the time, and now with the team fully focused on youth and development, that decision looks even worse. He never fit their timeline, and to make it worse, he hasn't played at an all-star level or anything close to it since that extension hit. He's missed a ton of time because of injuries, and his play on the court is regressing and deterring teams from trading for him, so overall it's just not a great situation to be in, unless of course you're Kevin Love himself making all that money. Next up is the Detroit Pistons, and the worst contract on their payroll right now is Mason Plumlee. The choice here would have been Blake Griffin by a pretty wide margin, but he did just get bought out and is no longer on the team, so the next best choice here is Plumlee. The Pistons are now in rebuild mode, and they have a ton of young frontcourt players in need of minutes if they're going to develop as the team intends, yet they also signed Plumlee to a contract worth about $8 million per year to start him every night in their starting lineup as well. He could be used as trade bait, but until that happens, he's the choice here. Up next is the Indiana Pacers, and their worst contract right now is Jeremy Lamb. The Pacers are another team that don't really have a quote-unquote bad contract per se, and Lamb himself is definitely a valuable role player in their rotation that can score the ball in bunches and provide good energy off the bench, but his $10 million per year, again, had to be the choice almost by default, because all of the other players around him are on more team-friendly deals, and a lot of the role players are also on expiring contracts. Next up is the Miami Heat, and the player with their worst contract right now is Andre Iguodala, being paid $15 million this year. Iggy has been one of the best role players on some of the best teams in recent history because of his premier defensive skills and versatile offensive ability, but at this point in his career he's 37 years old and he's well over the hill, and his impact on the team's rotation just is not worth that much money anymore. His experience and leadership are still incredibly important and have helped the Heat team big time during their finals run last year, but in the present, it's just not the same. Next up is the Milwaukee Bucks, and the selection here is DJ Augustin. Augustin was a recent free agent signee, and he was brought in on a 3-year deal worth $7 million per year to be a good veteran leader that runs the second unit and shoots the ball well, as he's done throughout most of his career. However, age finally seems to be catching up with him. His shooting touch has been off all year long, making just 35% of his field goal attempts, and he's now a pretty big cap hit on a team that already has most of their money tied up in the future. Next up is the New York Knicks, and this is another example of a team with no real bad contracts per se, so by default I chose Kevin Knox. The Knicks are made up almost entirely of players on expiring 1-year contracts, and those that aren't are pretty much all paid fairly, so Knox being under contract for another year after this season, while still performing as poorly as he has since he's been drafted, made me lean towards him as the pick here again, as a choice by default. Up next is the Orlando Magic, and their worst contract right now is Al-Farouq Aminu, getting paid $10 million per year for this year and next year. Aminu was a recent signing meant to strengthen the team's depth as they started to finally crack through into the playoffs, but as we've seen from several players in this video, he's another example of an aging player whose production has dipped mightily since getting paid, and his injuries have also plagued his Magic career as well. Next up is the Philadelphia 76ers, and their worst contract right now is Tobias Harris. Harris has, without question, had a huge turnaround season so far this year, playing pretty dang good basketball, and he even put himself into All-Star consideration. But the fact remains that he got paid a full max contract that will give him over $35 million in each of the next 3 years, and even though he's playing much better, he just isn't the caliber of player worth that much money. Next is the Toronto Raptors, and their worst contract right now is Pascal Siakam, who is getting paid a max contract worth about $34 million annually. The Raptors also, for the most part, spend their money wisely, but after a year last year where Siakam was an all-star player, this year he's taken a bit of a step back, and while he is still very good, whether or not he's worthy of a max contract is a conversation worth having. And finally, the last team is the Washington Wizards, and their worst contract right now is Russell Westbrook. Westbrook is being paid the supermax, and his days as an all-star in the league seem to be over. They took a chance by trading for him this summer, hoping to elevate themselves into the playoffs, and so far that has just not happened, and he seems to be on the downward slope of his career. And with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below who you think are also on some pretty bad contracts in the grand scheme of things for teams in this conference. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next video with the Western Conference teams.